Hey everybody, welcome to Leading Thriving Cities. My name is Chad Wright. I'm the founder of Forward Partners. This is our new show where we want to spotlight leadership in public service and have deep conversations about sustainability and how we create a thriving future for our cities. You are going to love today's conversation. My guest is Katherine Caffrey. She served for almost 2 decades in public service and recently retired from the city of Cedar Park as the deputy city manager. We have such good conversations about her career and what she learned along the way, the constant connection required from being a city manager, and the deep thinking that goes into every single decision, how we agonize over those things. And we really dive into what's needed for the future and how we as cities need to learn to be more flexible. It is such a wide-ranging conversation that I know you're going to find value in. So thank you for joining us right here on Leading Thriving Cities. So the part of why we're doing this show is because we want to kind of shine a spotlight on the challenges of leading in city management and help people really understand what that looks like and have conversations around how do we do this in a way in the future that it's sustainable, we can have thriving teams, because I think that's a real struggle sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so I love this first question we dive into, because you spent 16, 17 years with the city of Cedar Park?
And then a couple with another city before.
Okay, gotcha. Mm-hmm. And so you spent some time in the city manager's office, like a lot of
over
those
a decade,
years,
and
doing all kinds of work with that. And so what's always interesting is how people don't really understand those roles. I think people in the public don't know what a city manager does. I think even people within organization, they know it's the top person, but they don't really know what they do. And so what is one thing you really wish people understood about that role?
I think I wish people understood how much time is spent on every decision, whether it's an internal one or external. I think sometimes, and I think this is true for any time you think about like the people in charge, but it can look like decisions just come out. There's really no
magically they appear.
Or like, why is that taking so long, or where did that come from? But in reality, I can hardly think of a time we did not have an important issue, whether that was to employees, whether a small group of employees, a lot of employees, definitely to the community and external facing, that there wasn't a great deal of thought and intentionality put into that. And so I guess I wish people knew we recognize how important our role is as sort of stewards of like all the work the employees do, right? Because I mean, you have in many cases hundreds, thousands of employees out there really serving the public every day, and they're the ones actually doing the hard work that the public sees. But really the role of the city manager is to make sure things are running smoothly, things are going in the right direction, and inevitably when you involve people and the public, things go awry. And so there's definitely decisions that need to be made, hard issues that need to be sort of really vetted through, where there isn't everybody's not going to be happy with the outcome. And so those we never took lightly. I mean, they were always very discussed, very thought about, a lot of sleepless nights. It doesn't matter what your personality type is.
And people don't see that type, right? They don't see the amount of time you spend, the sleepless nights. They don't understand. All they see is the final choice, and they judge it. Either they like it or they don't.
In like 10 seconds.
And why would you idiots do this thing I don't like? And you're going, we have sweated over this for 3 months. That's interesting. I would imagine that creates a lot of, we talk about burnout all the time. If you feel like you're on this hamster wheel of just putting all this thought and effort into something that nobody ever really sees the effort. They just see the final outcome. That's got to be part of that burnout, right? That exhaustion that comes from that cycle.
Yeah, I think it is exhausting, right? So it's exhausting, to be just constantly dealing with problems, which when you're in a healthy state, it's like, ooh, the new challenge of the day. When you're a little more tired, burnout, less healthy, it definitely feels like another one. And I remember something a mentor told me early on was he said, the higher up you go, everything that is brought to you is hard, complex, and like very nuanced. And it's so true because the higher up you move in an organization or, wherever you are, no one brings you like the softballs. No one ever walked into my office and was like, this is a real easy win. I didn't take it. I brought it to you to take.
You can have it.
Yes, like I wanted you to make
Here's
this really
gift.
easy decision with lots of winners. that just doesn't happen, right?
No.
So you need to sort of be the type of person that like enjoys that exercise.
Yes.
But I think it's also hard because there is so much complexity to these issues, especially when it comes to things about how resources are spent, which if you think about issues to the public or employees, it's always about that really, whether it's pay or what's getting funded or why was there an investment here and not an investment there. It's really all about resources. And there is a lot of complexity that you don't want to bore the average person with necessarily, to be like, well, the state law says we can only use money this way, and then this was earmarked for this, and they like glaze over.
Yes.
But I do think we could probably do ourselves a favor in city management by maybe explaining a little more.
Okay.
Because I think
so find that middle ground between we're breaking out the spreadsheets and we're telling you nothing. There's a middle ground of we're going to explain it to you in ways that you can understand quickly and easily and digest. And that the problem is you're talking about the amount of time it takes to take a big complex thing and say, how do we simply convey this? Coming from the marketing world, that's all we did, right? How do we put things into one sentence so people will buy something? It's the same art, and it's so difficult to do. It's so much harder. It's so much easier to just say, well, here's the spreadsheet. You get it or you don't.
Yeah. And that never goes well.
No. It turns out they don't want that. They just want to be told what they want to be told.
Yes.
It's really interesting as we think about this because we talk a lot about the I get to versus I have to. And when we're healthy, when we're doing good, bring me the problem. I get to solve this problem today. And then at some point it shifts to I have to. I have to solve this problem today. And I'm curious how far into your journey, once you hit the city manager's office, kind of at that assistant or deputy city manager role, how far was it into that before you went from I get to I have to? Like when does that shine start to wear off?
Probably when I became an assistant city manager.
Okay.
Before that, I was a department head.
Yep.
And I was a department head that sort of had a really strong dotted line to the CMO, the city manager's office. So I was very connected to them.
Yeah.
You know, when you're a department head, and that has a hard job too.
Yes.
It has lots of its own challenges and issues. So I'm not saying it's a walk in the park, but you do get to do a lot more. And you get to sort of show these wins and like, look at these things we've accomplished. When you become an assistant city manager, deputy, and really even CM, people don't really know what you're doing, right? Like, you didn't make those potholes filled. You didn't like build that park, you know.
And it doesn't go well if you try. Let's be honest.
What do you mean you like facilitated that? Yeah. So I would say definitely when I got to be an assistant city manager was probably the first time I was like, ooh, this is. It was very challenging for me.
Yeah.
Personally, like internally, it was very hard for me. That was a rocky adjustment to that role.
Are the wins less clear at that level? Like it seems like at the director level, there's some pretty clear-cut wins that you can point to and say, hey, we mattered, we did good.
Yeah.
And is it the complexity of the problems at the city manager level that makes the wins less obvious? Or is it just that for every decision you make, someone is unhappy? It's hard to point to anything and say that is a decisive win for everyone.
I think it's like how you define the wins is different.
Okay.
So I'm always really reluctant to use sports analogies because I don't know anything about sports. But if you're a department head, you're like making the goal. If you're an assistant city manager really your success is being the goalie. So it's like preventing the problems.
Yeah.
And usually if you're doing your job well and you've prevented whatever issue, nobody knows about it.
Yes. Nobody sees that we just saved $5 million on a project.
Right. Or like that could have gone really wrong and I like stepped in.
Yeah.
And so depending on your personality type, and you know me and you know what I am, so I'm a little like, what do you mean nobody's going to know I did that? Like, I would like to advertise that I did that. And that's an adjustment for sure.
Yes.
You're also probably for the first time dealing with subject matters you don't know anything about.
Okay.
And that can definitely trigger a lot of insecurity.
Yes.
And I think it doesn't matter what your gender is because, as I got further along in Cedar Park, I saw multiple new assistant city managers come in. And everyone had a sense of like,
deer in the headlights.
I don't actually know anything about fill in the blank department.
Yeah.
And it can take a while to get comfortable with like, I've never been a police officer.
Yeah.
I've never been in IT, or whatever it may be. And so that can be an adjustment.
So we did an episode yesterday of the Leader Lab where we talked about fake it till you make it and some of the potential pitfalls of that idea. When you step into that role and you look around and go, oh, I know nothing. Do you go into fake it till you make it mode, or is there the vulnerability to say, hey, I don't know this, and the quickest way to knowledge is saying, I don't know?
I think it's a blend, right?
Okay.
Because you don't want to have the person who's reporting under you think why is this person in charge of me? So
How did this idiot
you want
get
to be
promoted?
vulnerable, but you don't want to maybe be quite so I don't even know how to turn on the printer. You don't want to.
To be fair, nobody knows how to turn on the printer.
To be fair, at the end, I was like, I still don't understand these servers. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But so I think it's a blend.
Okay.
What I also find helps, though, is really reaching out to your peer network.
Yes.
Outside organization. So I remember even when I took deputy and I got public safety, which was really not my background, and I knew they were probably the most like high stakes departments you could have.
Absolutely.
I reached out to a city manager at another city that I had, gotten to know pretty well, and I said, "What do you ask your chiefs when you meet with them?" And he said, "I asked 4 things." And he told me what they were, and I was like, "Oh, okay, got it." So, I mean, you can also kind of look to some of your peers.
Yes. That's the thing. As I've gotten involved deeper with city management, y'all have a strong peer network. Like that is the interesting part about it. Now. Whether there's always the vulnerability to reach out to that network is a whole different conversation sometimes, but you do have the network. Every city manager I meet, they know the 10 other city managers I'm connected with deeply, and they know them really well. And I'm always amazed by that. It's almost like there's this, I don't know if it's a survival thing, like I have to find someone else that knows how to do this because the stakes are so high. But it's always hard is building that community, and y'all do a pretty decent job of that. I'm pretty impressed by it.
It's definitely one of the special things to being in this line of work because we don't have the competition that you would maybe have if this was a private sector environment.
Yes.
So, I mean, yes, you're sort of competing with other cities, but not really, right? And so I think there's that safe space to sort of be vulnerable with each other. And I would say I probably felt more comfortable being open about times I was unsure with other city managers than I did necessarily with employees until I really felt like I was comfortable enough that I had a track record that I could be vulnerable, but yet people know, like, I get stuff done.
I may not know these things, but I am good at these things.
This.
And yes, I'm competent enough to find the solutions.
Right.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So as you kind of went on this journey, what was one of the biggest internal challenges you had to overcome? Because you're taking on all new things, learning new things. So what was the hardest piece for you internally that you wrestled with?
Well, I'm going to tell you, and then you'll be like, that's because she's an Enneagram 3. So at my core, I am a people pleaser, and I want to be liked.
Yeah.
And in many ways, those served me really well in my career, right? I mean,
that's part of how you got where you were.
I mean, the positive part to it is that I really care about my relationships with people. I really care how people feel about our interactions.
Yes. Yeah.
And like, did we leave in a good place? I mean, like, those things are so foundational to like who I am and how I interact with people. The drawback is when you get into management and definitely higher up roles, it's like what we're talking about. Nobody's bringing you in this like easy, problem with like, everybody's going to win at the end. And so inevitably you can't be liked all the time and be doing your job correctly.
Yeah.
And I would say as I initially got into those roles, that was very uncomfortable for me. And then I got better at it as I sort of discovered I should worry less about being liked and more about people feeling like I was authentic.
Okay.
I got some feedback once from somebody that dagger to my heart, but it was that they thought I was fake and insincere.
Ah, okay.
And I remember thinking like, what?
Yeah.
I am not fake or insincere. But when I really reflected on it, and even now looking back, because that was almost 10 years ago.
Yeah.
I think it was just that people pleaser kicking in rather than are we being honest and authentic with each other?
Yes.
And I think in the last few years of my career, I think back to when I would talk to employees that maybe didn't directly report to me. So maybe we have, there's some distance between us, which usually would make me be even more sort of like, I want to, be like the best person to them. But I remember in particular one where it was a compensation issue, which nothing hits employees more than that, understandably. And I said, well, I've made the decision to do this. That was my decision, and this is why, and these are my reasons.
Yeah.
And it was definitely not what they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
But I could tell they took it better because they were like, well, she told us, and she took the time to do this. So when I focused more on like, let's be authentic with each other and let's make sure people feel like I'm genuine, it was okay that they didn't always like what I did.
Yes. And that's it's funny because even we talk personality types all the time in the work we do. And so as an Enneagram 3, the achiever, that is the path to really health, is learning to say, okay, this is the authentic version of me. And whether you like it or not, this is who I am. And so I'm going to be that in this scenario.
Right.
And not try to appear successful or appear like your best friend. And that is the hardest thing to do. But you discover as you do that more and more, you are actually more successful because people latch on and go, okay, this human is someone I can trust. And that's really what it is I may not always have the answer you like, but I will give you the answer. And that means a lot when it comes to leadership. So as you wrestled with that feedback was obviously not easy to not easy to process, right? And that is one of the harder things, but we always look back on those pivotal moments and go, okay, that was painful but valuable. And so as you navigated this, how did you open up more to getting feedback like that? Like, were you intentional about being open and saying, hey, I want to know how I'm doing as a leader?
Yeah, I was probably like annoyingly desperate about it. Because again, when you start in your career, you get lots of feedback.
Yes.
And you're maybe not, when you're in your 20s or starting out in your career, you're probably not that well equipped to receive it.
Yes.
But that's when you're going to get the most of it. And then you move up in your career, and the amount of people that will give you feedback really goes down.
Yes.
And so when I
left,
even
honest feedback.
Oh my gosh, you have to like beg and plead for it. And so by the time I left the city, I was, I'd had a very lucky career there, but I only had kind of my boss that would give me any feedback.
Yes.
And so when I would go to peers even, or department heads that didn't work for me anymore, but like, please tell me something.
Yeah.
It was always packaged.
Yeah.
Softly.
Yeah.
So I think I was desperate for feedback.
Yeah.
And I probably did get some that was helpful, but I'm always like, what else? What else? What else is bothering you?
Because there's always that I know there's a higher level. I know there's more I can do.
Yeah.
That's interesting because I think every leader at those higher levels wrestles with that because I think there's innate fear. When a leader comes down and says, what am I doing wrong? Unless we have established a real environment of honesty where we are okay putting our problems on the table and pointing directly to it and saying, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah.
Unless we've created that, they're scared. What is going to happen? What blowback is going to come back on me because I give honest feedback?
Yeah.
And so that's something as we think about city managers or people coming up in this world is are we creating that environment? Are we creating an environment where growth is our focus? And that's from the top all the way down, that none of us have ever arrived.
Right.
It doesn't matter what the title
Yep.
is. That takes so much intentionality to do. And I'm not sure how many cities are really doing that well.
Probably not a lot. But when I hear about some of it, I'm always like, ooh, that person, they're really doing it. But I also think if you get the opportunity to receive that feedback, man, take it responsibly and do something with it. Because nothing will shut down future feedback more than I did give you honest feedback and you did nothing with it.
Yes.
And I think that happens pretty frequently.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it is an interesting move there to get the feedback and then share that with some people and say, hey, here's what somebody said. I'm trying to understand this. Do you see this in me? Do you experience this? Other city managers, have y'all had some feedback like this? What did you do with it? Like, is that ever a conversation with others, or is it just something you internally kind of wrestle with?
I think normally it's something internally. I mean, I have had in the last few months a conversation with a city manager who we knew each other, but I didn't think we were particularly close.
Yeah.
And they opened up to me about some problems they were having in their office. And I thought, wow, how open is this person to tell me this? So I really thought a lot more of them of like, wow, you're really aware of this. You're talking to me and I don't even work with you about this. But it also, and I mean, I was then able to share, that happens here too. That happens there. You know, these are
you're not alone.
These are universal problems that happen. But yeah, I mean, if you get the feedback, you definitely have to be in a healthy enough place to feel the defensiveness, but like swallow it and like live in, I'm going to actually like sit with this uncomfortable information and see what I want to do with it.
Sit and just kind of wrestle with it. And that's the hard part.
Yeah.
You brought up something really interesting though, is you had a fellow leader who was vulnerable and your response was, oh my gosh, I respect this person so much more.
Yeah.
And that is when we talk about fake it till you make it, right? When we're scared to be vulnerable with anybody because we're afraid their response is going to be bad. Their response is almost always more respect because when we're vulnerable, we get to speak into things and say, hey, you're not alone. Guess what? We deal with the same thing. Part of my role is I go between all these different cities. is really helping them understand you're not by yourself. Whatever problem you are wrestling with, I promise you the next city over is wrestling with it. It is almost universal. But then there is that moment of, hey, they're human and I'm human, and it's okay for us to be human and do this job. And that's the part that I think when you have to be armored up all the time, when you're afraid of what employees are going to say or what the public is going to do or whether the council is going to vote to fire you, you know, which in this environment is really, really tough. When you're always armored up against everything, there's no chance to be vulnerable. And so being very intentional about that, I think that'll be an interesting role you play as you go forward in your career with your new consulting company, working with other cities, is you know their world. You have been in their shoes, and you might get to have some more honest conversations that they don't really always have an outlet for. And that's a very, very valuable role. It really is. Wow. So you spent about 19 years, 20 years in public service. And so if you had to go back to the early version of you who was just getting into public service and thinking this is a role I might want to take on, what advice would you give yourself?
First, I would still tell myself to do it.
Okay.
I mean, public service is hands down such a great profession wherever you land in it, right?
Yes.
I mean, if you want to work in an arena where you get to see the results of your labor and actually make a positive contribution, there is no better place than public service, and I would definitely argue than local government. I mean, you see the results of your work. You can work much faster. Yes. I mean, I still, even though I've going on a month left the public sector, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's still the best place to start. You should definitely go there. I hope I go back someday. It's so great. But what I think I wish I had told myself was the public sector, I'm going to say local government, city management, can also be all-consuming. Because you are working in a 24/7 environment where literally the factory's never closed. You know what I mean? Like, you're always going.
Yes. There's always pipes breaking
there's
somewhere.
There's always something. It's always Christmas when that pipe breaks, whatever. There's always something going on. It's not a 9-to-5 job, so there's a lot of evening, weekend stuff that is required or sort of like, asterisk required you go to. So there's a lot, and it can be very all-consuming. And I sometimes tell people that city management is a lifestyle. It's not a job.
Yeah.
And it really kind of is. And so I think what I wish I had told myself was, don't give up the hobbies and the friendships and the relationships with people that have nothing to do with your job.
Yeah.
Because those will remind you of who you are as a person. And I let a lot of those go, right? It starts with like, oh, I've got 2 other meetings this week. I don't want to do another night out, so I'm going to skip whatever, yoga, book club, seeing my friend, whatever. And, over time, they just sort of fade away, and your whole life has become your job.
Yes. You become the city,
You
essentially.
are.
Yeah.
I mean, you probably live there at this point. And I mean, there's just so many things that it becomes everything that you are.
Yeah.
And so I think I would definitely tell people starting out, especially if they're hungry and eager, dive in and do the work now. Your life may be less complicated now than it will be 15, 20 years from now when you factor in
almost always
spouses,
the case.
kids, houses, all that stuff. But don't give up the stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with your job.
Yes. You know what's interesting is how often we hear that in law enforcement, right?
Oh, yeah.
You get into law enforcement, and so maybe it's not a law enforcement thing, it's a public service thing. It is what are you giving yourself over to, and do you have an identity outside of that? Because we're bad about that as human beings, but in public service, and like I said, in law enforcement, you hear this all the time. When you become an officer, you are passionate about everything, the whole culture of it. You're spending all your off hours at the PD. And it's very, very similar with what you do. Yes, it becomes fellow police officers, and it's very similar in city management. It's city employees, it's city people you're connected to, and ultimately you do lose that. That's a fascinating idea. And I'm wondering, when you think about city management too, when you get to that highest level, when you become city manager, you are always 3 votes away from being fired, which is exhausting to kind of always be under that and always having to maintain those relationships. But if that ever happens, how much of your identity do you lose? If you spent the last 15 or 20 years being this is who you are. I'm wondering how damaging that is for people that end up in that situation, because it is not uncommon for genuinely great city managers to be fired.
Oh, yeah.
It happens all the time.
Right.
And so there's that loss of identity that can come with that. I would imagine how do we get more intentional about that? How do we make sure that when people go on this journey that they don't end up losing their identity to it?
Well, I think it's actually a lot of the work you do, right? So this is an unintentional plug for Ford Partners. But I do think it depends on the person, right? So the person needs to recognize that they need to create space in their life for things that have nothing to do with their work so that they can be a complete person. Mm-hmm. And so I think making the effort to really think, am I healthy? Am I taking care of myself? What am I doing that has nothing to do with my job? Is really huge in that. Yeah. Because also, it's so true. You hear it's a cliche, but it's a cliche because it's true. Employees look at what their boss is doing as the guide for like what is expected. Yes. So if you are emailing at all hours of the day and expecting a response, if you are texting all the time or whatever, it is very hard for employees to feel like they can kind of turn things off. Now, obviously that depends on your role, what your responsibilities are, all that stuff, right? Because I mean, now anybody listening to this is like, Kat emailed me a lot at 10:30 at night. But that was when it was convenient for me. But I do think it's really creating that space for employees to be that. So if you're that person, not only do you need to do it for you, but you need to do it for everybody around you and your family. Who I think if you really picked at it and were like, do you feel like I'm really present? They'd be like, well, actually, I think about how many city council meetings my husband heard about, and I never was like, what happened in your staff meeting today at work? Like it was very one-sided. And so, that's not great either.
It's in a marriage like that, it's like there's the husband, there's the wife, there's the city. It's like a 3-entity marriage.
It is, yeah.
And that's got to be challenging sometimes.
Well, John Caffrey would be like, yes, it is.
We need to have him as a guest to
he would just pop in and be like, I'd like
side.
to add to this question. But yeah, I think you owe it to yourself to sort of to develop who you are and not lose sight of that. Yeah. And my first boss, who is a city manager in the city of Little Rock, and I think I mentioned to you, he very unexpectedly passed away in the fall. And, I was like in my early 20s getting started with him. He gave me all this sage wisdom that in my 2-year-old brain, I was like, But I remember he said to me,
to be fair, that's what every 22-year-old
I know,
brain sounds
I'm like,
like,
all that wisdom was wasted on me. But he said, the city won't love you back. And I mean, it shouldn't be that negative, right? But I think what it does mean is like, it is a job. Yeah. It's a lifestyle, but remember at the core, it's a part of what you're supposed to be doing with who you are. It is not everything. Yeah. And you just have to remember that, because at any moment, the city could not love you back and say thanks, but no thanks. Yes. And then what are you doing? Yeah.
That's really powerful, because it is the purpose you serve, the good you do is phenomenal, but it's not all we're put here for, right? There are the families we're raising and the legacies we're leaving there. And in that journey, if we lose that piece of it, because I have done no research into divorce rates for city managers, but I'm guessing it's probably kind of like law enforcement. It's probably a lot higher than what we would like it to be. And so this becomes kind of the journey. Can we go on a journey where we talk about sustainability all the time? If marriages are breaking, then there's something unsustainable about our rhythms and how we're doing this. If we are getting fired constantly, then there's something unsustainable about that rhythm in a lot of ways. And so I'm really curious. I joke these days that I'm betting the next 40 years of our company on the idea that a city cannot thrive unless the city staff is thriving, that they have to be in a good position for the city to actually thrive. And so as we think about that, like I think a lot of cities will struggle with this, helping their workforce thrive. What do we need to entirely rethink in terms of how we structure things or lead or do things in order to allow our staffs to thrive?
I am definitely not a workforce expert, but I think all employees want two things. They want purpose and they want to feel valued. And it doesn't matter if you're public sector or private sector, right? Like every employee wants that. On one side of the ledger, I think the public sector is set up to totally succeed, right? Yes. Cities are ripe to show their employees the purpose of what they're doing and the results of their work. And, you can drive by and see blah, blah was done because of you or whatever. So, I mean, it's so ripe for that. And I think if cities were a little more intentional in those efforts, which really does come down to really some strategic communications and some programming. I mean, you could
training
really
leaders,
show, you could create a culture and show employees how much their work is purposeful and adding value.
You matter.
I think where we where we have more work to do
Yeah.
is on employees feeling valued. And obviously compensation and benefits are a huge part of that, but it's not the whole story. Although, I mean, you can't deny that is massive.
To most employees, because they don't have a sense of purpose, it is the whole story.
Right.
The money is the story,
Right.
and there is no other piece, because
Right.
we're not good at the purpose side all the time. Even though we should be. You're right. The
I mean,
conditions are
it's
there.
ripe for I mean, it's not that hard of a sell. Like, I mean, it's right there.
Well, and so much of the work we do with leaders is helping them start to recognize purpose and impact in everything they do, so they can then help their people see it. And I think as you're more intentional about that, the way I like to pitch it to leaders is, this is the one free resource you have. It's unlimited. The ability to point to something your people did and go, you matter.
Yeah.
That cannot be budget constrained.
Yeah,
You cannot propose a budget for a purpose and have somebody go, oh, we can't quite afford that this year. And so it's the one thing that doesn't require money.
Right.
But we want to try to solve everything with money.
Yeah.
But that is a side that has to be navigated, right?
Yeah, I mean, the compensation stuff is really challenging, but I think there's other things that I see cities not doing that I think we should do.
Like what?
So rarely am I a person that says, like, we should take a page out of the private sector, but this is a case where I think we should, right?
Yeah.
So I think you see employers of choice in the private sector with not just like amenities for people's workday, and I'm not talking about like ping pong tables, although I guess some people want those, but like programming and professional development that is sophisticated and nuanced. Instead, what I see is everything is very one size fits all. If you are a foreman in the public works department, you have the same professional development needs as the assistant city attorney.
Right.
And you know what? They don't.
No.
So
it's wildly different.
they're very different people.
Yeah.
So I think like more sophisticated kind of employee development could go a long way. And then I also kind of, if I had like a magic wand, wish that cities would lean into not feeling so constrained by very strict job descriptions and processes and pay plans for your rock stars.
Yeah, get creative.
Yeah. You know, in my career, one thing that I think went really well for me is I did have a boss that did that. She would say, oh, you're talented and I'm going to make things work so we can retain you. Yeah. And I think that doesn't happen often enough because there's this, this is the job description. Yeah. You know, and
here's the levels. This is all we have to work with.
This is what we've got. And that's not true.
Yeah.
It's actually not true.
Yeah.
And so I think cities want to get this incredible workforce. Yeah. And they need to. Yep. If you look at like the future of the issues that cities are going to be facing, they really do need to have kind of like level A players. Yes. But they have some work to do to kind of get that workforce and keep it.
Well, and it's funny you talk about flexibility because like in the police world, we run into this all the time where like, hey, we budgeted for 4 new people in certain roles. Right. We get partway into the year and go, oh, we don't need them in those roles. We actually need one of those to be different. Right. Well, that change is monumentally difficult to do. There's so many hoops you got to have to jump through. Yeah. Versus in an organization like a business, like if I decided we need to change roles, we could change roles. Yeah. It's as simple as talking it out, creating a plan. Let's go execute it. Yeah. We don't need council approval on anything. And so there is some flexibility, and I think there's a middle ground you're looking for because in the business world, we can also be so flexible and move so fast that we wreck things. We see that all the time. And cities can't risk that. They have to be stable, have to be very careful. But I think there is probably a more flexible version of a city. How do we get there? How do we help people who thrive probably on, not thrive, but they enjoy the safety of rigid systems? How do we get them to think outside of those systems about possibility?
I think you think about the consequences if you don't flex a little.
Okay.
So if you're going to stick by rigid, which is, you know, I don't mean that's bad, but like that probably should be the base case, right? Like the base case should be, we have these processes, these pay plans, and like these steps, and this is how this works. But when you have these special circumstances or you have these rock star employees where you need to kind of see where you can flex, you should, because I think the result, if you don't, is they're no longer going to be a rock star because they get burnt out, they get tired, they get kind of disgruntled, whatever, or they leave. Yeah. And so I think the results of you not doing it are bad enough that you'll maybe lean a little bit into like, where can we be flexible? Yeah. Obviously with some, you know, bumpers on that.
As we think about it, it's interesting. You've got these strict processes for how we're going to do things. You almost need a process for how we're going to be flexible.
Yeah.
When we recognize here's a need for flexibility, great, we know how to do that.
Right.
We have step 1, 2, 3, and 4. We know how to be flexible. And I'm a big believer, once there's a framework, people are more likely to follow it. They are more likely to do it. And it's funny how often getting people to flex different muscles. If you've got a city manager who they just don't think flexibly at all, getting them to start to think flexibly, it's like getting a person that doesn't know how to ride a bike to ride a bike. If you just point to the bike and go ride it, that's not helpful. But if you say, hey, here is step 1 through 10 for how to do this well, and we're okay with the fact that you're not going to do it perfectly, that creates opportunity for them to do that. I think that's going to be really interesting in the future to see how do we start to help city management be more flexible when it is helpful. I think there's times they would like to be more flexible.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of a lot of times. There was one time in particular years ago where like we were hiring somebody. It was like a mid-level position, not in city management. It was in a department, and there was one position, but we had 2 great candidates, and I was like, oh, well, then we're going to hire both of them, and we're going to mush this stuff around and make this work, and it was just like, I was like, we can. And like, I'm going to go like figure this out. So I think also it's creating a culture where the people in departments and managers, they start sort of thinking creatively to know that like that's on the table. It doesn't mean everything is taken. It doesn't mean you get to do every idea, but like you do have to create a culture where they feel like they can say, well, could we possibly hire both of them? You know, and let's talk about it. Let's see if we can, you know. Why would you want to turn down 2 good employees? You know, like, oh my gosh, you'd be so much better off with
You know,
that.
in Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, he talks about the key is not the strategy. It's not how the big inventions we're going to do. It's the right people in the right seats. And so when the right people show up as a city, we need to find a way to put them in a seat,
For
right?
sure.
And not lose them to something else. Because finding the right people, it's interesting. And this was an adjustment I had to make when I got involved in city world. I come from the business world where if an employee's not clicking, you fire them. Oh, yeah. And in the city space, it is, hey, if they are checking this minimum box here, we can't do anything. And you end up with people that are essentially stuck for 20 years. And they're the people that retire and they're just miserable and they make everyone around them miserable and everybody's like secretly happy to see them go, you know. And so that structure is really hard. And so when you do have those people come in that are rock stars that you recognize, oh, there's something here. That is that you've identified something huge to be able to say, can we be flexible enough to get the good people in when we recognize them?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, I think when you think about the equation of a thriving organization, it's healthy leaders. If they're healthy and the majority of us are healthy, there's a chance we're going to thrive. If the majority of us are not, if we've got this big section of our team that's stuck and we can't get new blood in there and can't get new thinking in there, boy, you just atrophy really, really fast. That's going to be interesting to think about for the future.
Yeah.
Well, this was absolutely a great conversation. I really appreciate you being on.
Yeah.
You, as part of your role with City of Cedar Park, you tackled massive projects, right? What is it about those big capital projects that just invigorated you? What did you love about it?
I think I loved the complexity of them, and I loved that every day my goal was just to move it forward like 1 more inch. 1 more inch.
Yes.
1 more inch. So I guess I'm pretty persistent.
Yes.
So yeah, I think I just loved the complexity, and I knew that those type of initiatives really transformed communities.
Yes.
I mean, if you really wanted to move the needle, these giant beasts were the ones that would do it.
And they're so complex. Does that scare a lot of people off from tackling them?
I mean, a lot of people, that is not their cup of tea. I comment sometimes that I think you have to have the right temperament for those type of projects. You really need to be into sort of like everything is a problem that is coming your way. But man, the win feels so great when you're like, this is completely different from what it was before.
Yeah. And so with your new consulting company, that's what you're helping cities do more of. Give them capacity to be able to tackle some bigger projects with your expertise and the things that you've done in the past, right?
Yeah. So the idea is if a city has a big initiative or a big project, and you know, what's a big initiative kind of depends on the organization. But it's kind of like if it's big to you, it's big to me.
Yes.
You know, so whatever is really something that's foundational and kind of like moving things forward, but maybe you don't have capacity, maybe you don't have people with kind of the right temperament and skills. I guess I just, I love those.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
So if any city managers watching this want to find more
Yes.
information, where do they find you on the web?
So the website is navisguide.com. That's navisguide.com. Or they can find me on LinkedIn.
Perfect.
And yeah, I'd love to talk to them about what they got going on.
Love it. That is awesome. Thank you so much for this conversation. This was an absolute blast.
Yeah, thanks, Chad.
We'll have you back on again in the future.
Awesome. That'd be great.
Thank you for joining us for Leading Thriving Cities. We are dedicated to giving away everything we teach and, importantly, everything we learn while we're on the ground partnering with cities to develop healthy leaders and thriving teams. You can find all of that leadership development content on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Just search for @ForwardPartner. You can also find more information about what we do at forwardpartners.net.